August 15, 1943. A massive Allied armada, carrying over 35,000 American and Canadian troops, approaches the shores of Kiska Island in the remote Aleutians. Their mission: to storm a heavily fortified Japanese stronghold. After the brutal, bloody fight for the neighboring island of Attu just months before, every single man is steeled for a meat grinder. They are prepared for a fanatical enemy, dug into a labyrinth of complex tunnels and trenches, ready to defend every inch of the volcanic rock to the death. The landing craft ramps drop onto the black sand beaches. The first wave charges out, expecting a hail of machine gun fire and mortar shells. Then the next wave lands, and the next. But something is immediately and terrifyingly wrong. An eerie, unnatural silence hangs over the battlefield, broken only by the wind and the waves. No enemy fire. No movement. No resistance. The only thing they find on Kiska is the ghost of the enemy. This is the story of Operation Cottage, what history would later record as perhaps the most bizarre and tragically futile battle of the entire Second World War. It was an invasion built on a fundamental and catastrophic misconception. Allied planners, haunted by the recent carnage on Attu, were so utterly convinced of a fierce and decisive fight that they committed a massive force to take the island. But the enemy they were so prepared to die fighting had already vanished. The Japanese garrison was gone. And in the ensuing chaos, as over 30,000 nervous troops fanned out across the fog-shrouded, booby-trapped island, the only casualties would be inflicted not by the Japanese, but by the Allies upon themselves. Today, we will explore the incredible chain of events that led to this farcical tragedy. We will see how a combination of brilliant Japanese deception, perpetually terrible weather, and simple, tragic paranoia conspired to create a battle where friendly fire and accidents were the sole cause of over 300 Allied casualties. This is the story of the invasion of an empty island. The Aleutian chain of Alaska, a string of volcanic islands stretching far into the North Pacific, was one of the most unforgiving environments of the entire war. Dubbed the birthplace of winds, it was a place of perpetually howling gales, dense fog, freezing rain, and a landscape of treeless, spongy tundra that could swallow a man's boot. It was, by all accounts, a terrible place to fight a war, which made the events that unfolded there all the more remarkable. The strategic context of the Aleutian campaign begins in the aftermath of the attack on Pearl Harbor and the Battle of Midway in June 1942. Seeking to divert American forces away from the main Japanese thrust at Midway and to secure a northern buffer for their home islands, the Japanese Imperial Navy launched a secondary operation against the Aleutians. In a move that stunned the American public, Japanese forces landed unopposed on two of the westernmost islands, Attu and Kiska. This marked the first time foreign enemy forces had occupied American soil since the War of 1812. For the United States, the invasion was a profound shock and a deep blow to national pride. While the strategic value of the islands was hotly debated, some saw them as a potential stepping stone for a Japanese attack on the West Coast, while others viewed them as a useless, fog-bound sinkhole for resources. The political and psychological imperative was undeniable. American soil had been violated, and it had to be retaken. Thus began the Thousand-Mile War, a brutal, costly, and largely forgotten sideshow fought at the very edge of the world. The Allied effort to reclaim the islands began with a protracted and grueling blockade and bombing campaign against the Japanese garrisons. But everyone knew that ultimately, it would require a bloody, boots-on-the-ground invasion. The first and obvious target was the smaller island of Attu. In May 1943, the U.S. 7th Infantry Division landed to retake the island, expecting a swift victory against a supposedly isolated and weakened enemy. They were tragically mistaken. The Battle of Attu proved to be one of the most savage and costly engagements of the Pacific Theater, relative to the number of troops involved. The Japanese defenders, though outnumbered and cut off from supply, did not cede an inch of the treacherous, fog-wreathed terrain willingly. They fought with fanatical determination from expertly concealed positions in the high passes and mountains, forcing the American troops to fight for every yard in freezing conditions, often with bayonets and grenades in hand-to-hand combat. The climax of the battle was a chilling foreshadowing of the desperation that would later characterize fights on Saipan and Iwo Jima. On May 29th, with their situation hopeless, the remaining Japanese soldiers launched a massive suicidal banzai charge. In a wild, screaming frenzy, they overran American frontline positions, bursting into field hospitals and engaging in chaotic close-quarters combat with rear-echelon troops using rifles, swords, and even rocks. It was the largest banzai charge of the Pacific War. When the fighting finally subsided, the cost was staggering. Nearly the entire Japanese garrison of 2,900 men was wiped out. But the American victory came at an appalling price. Over 2,500 U.S. casualties, including 549 killed. The brutal reality of Act II seared itself into the minds of Allied commanders. It was a stark lesson in the tenacity of the Japanese soldier when defending fortified positions. This trauma, the memory of that violent and costly struggle on a small remote island, is the essential key to understanding the massive overreaction that was to come at Kiska. In the minds of American planners, Act II was not an anomaly. It was the blueprint. If a small garrison on a small island could inflict such pain, then the prospect of assaulting Kiska, a larger island known to hold a much larger garrison, estimated at over 5,000 men with more extensive fortifications, was a nightmare scenario. The assumption was absolute. Kiska would be Act II, but magnified. It would be a meat grinder of the highest order, requiring an overwhelming force to avoid another bloodbath. The ghost of Act II, therefore, cast a long and decisive shadow, setting the stage for one of the greatest anticlimaxes, and one of the most tragic farces, in modern military history. The fall of Act II in May 1943 left the Japanese garrison on Kiska in an untenable position. They were now completely isolated, a lone outpost on American soil, cut off from supply and reinforcement by a tightening Allied naval blockade. The commander of the Japanese Northern Area Force, Vice Admiral Boshiro Hosogaya, knew that a massive Allied invasion was inevitable and that his forces on Kiska would share the same fate as their comrades on Act II, annihilation. However, where the Allies expected a desperate last-stand defense, the Japanese High Command conceived a brilliant and audacious plan, not to reinforce, but to evacuate. This operation, code-named Operation KE, was a high-stakes gamble that relied on stealth, weather, and precise execution. The plan was for a powerful naval task force, including 2 light cruisers and several destroyers, to brave the Allied patrols, dash into Kiska Harbor under the cover of the region's infamous fog, embark the entire garrison, and escape, all within the span of a single hour. The execution of Operation KE on July 28, 1943, was a masterpiece of military deception and efficiency. As a thick, impenetrable fog blanketed the island and the surrounding sea, a common yet perfectly timed meteorological occurrence, the Japanese flotilla slipped through the gaps in the American blockade. The U.S. naval cordon, plagued by the same poor visibility and believing the weather too foul for any enemy movement, had temporarily withdrawn to safer positions. In a frantic, pre-rehearsed ballet of survival, the 5,183 Japanese soldiers abandoned their positions and rushed to the harbor. For 55 incredible minutes, the evacuation proceeded with disciplined silence and speed. The men boarded the waiting warships, leaving behind only empty barracks, a few stray dogs, and a landscape littered with booby traps. As silently as they had arrived, the Japanese ships disappeared back into the fog, carrying the entire garrison to safety in the Kuril Islands. The Allies, who had braced for a bloody fight, had been presented with a stunning strategic sleight of hand, and they had seen nothing. Meanwhile, Allied intelligence was piecing together a picture of the situation on Kiska, but it was a picture painted almost entirely by assumption and misinterpretation. Aerial reconnaissance flights, the primary tool for gauging enemy activity, were consistently thwarted by the same persistent fog that had enabled the escape. The few photos that were taken showed no significant movement, but this was interpreted not as evidence of an absence, but as evidence of a well-dug-in enemy staying hidden in their tunnels. More convincing, however, was the radio intelligence. Allied signals monitoring stations continued to intercept Japanese radio transmissions from the Kiska area. What they did not realize was that this was a deliberate deception. The Japanese had left behind a small team to operate the radios, or potentially use transmissions from their Korean bases, to maintain the illusion of an active garrison. To the analysts at Pearl Harbor and in Washington, the chatter was definitive proof that the enemy was still present and active. This perfect storm of natural obstruction and human deception cemented the Allied conviction. Every piece of circumstantial evidence was filtered through the traumatic lens of the Battle of Attu. The silence from the island wasn't seen as emptiness. It was seen as the calm before the storm. The lack of visual confirmation wasn't proof of evacuation. It was proof of the enemy's skill at camouflage. The conclusion in the minds of the Allied High Command was inescapable and, from their perspective, perfectly logical. Kiska was still held by a powerful, determined, and waiting Japanese force. The stage was now tragically set. The planners, armed with this flawed intelligence and haunted by the ghosts of Attu, greenlit the massive invasion of Kiska. Operation Cottage, one of the largest Allied amphibious assaults in the Pacific, was launched against an enemy that had already vanished, setting in motion a chain of events that would lead not to a glorious victory, but to a tragic and farcical confrontation with their own fears. On August 15, 1943, one of the largest Allied amphibious forces in the Pacific theater descended upon Kiska. The invasion fleet was a colossal armada, a testament to the expected ferocity of the fight. It carried over 34,000 battle-ready troops, a combined force of the U.S. 7th Infantry Division, still bearing the psychological scars of Attu, and a powerful contingent of the Canadian 6th Infantry Division, eager to prove themselves in their first major combat operation of the war. As their landing craft churned through the cold gray water towards the black volcanic sand beaches, a palpable tension gripped every man. They were braced for the deafening roar of artillery, the whip-crack of sniper fire, and the deadly crisscross of machine guns that had characterized the landings at Attu. They stormed the beaches with weapons raised, hearts pounding, expecting at any moment to see the muzzle flashes of a determined enemy dug into the hills. But the only sound that greeted them was the wind and the surf. They found abandoned gun emplacements, empty trenches already half collapsed from the elements, and a profound, unsettling silence. The initial wave of relief at the lack of resistance was quickly replaced by a creeping, unnerving dread. Where was the enemy? This eerie void, however, did not remain peaceful for long. The very elements that had allowed the Japanese to escape now conspired to turn the empty island into a deadly battlefield. A thick, disorienting fog rolled in, reducing visibility to mere feet and muffling sound in a way that was both claustrophobic and terrifying. In this soupy gloom, the intricate, multi-pronged landing plan quickly unraveled. Units lost all visual and radio contact with each other, their advances becoming a confused and directionless groping through the murk. The absolute silence was broken only by the distant, unnerving sounds of other squads moving, sounds that could just as easily be a friendly patrol as an enemy ambush. After days of waiting for a fight that never came, nerves were stretched to the breaking point. Every soldier was a coiled spring of tension, his finger resting on the trigger, his mind conjuring shadows in the fog into Japanese soldiers. It was in this pressure cooker of fear and disorientation that the inevitable tragedy occurred. The friendly fire began as isolated, terrifying incidents before escalating into a chaotic melee. A Canadian patrol, hearing the crunch of boots and indistinct voices through the fog, opened fire with rifles and a Bren light machine gun, only to discover they had engaged an American unit, who promptly returned fire in a panic. In another sector, American troops, spooked by movement in the mist, called in mortar fire on what they believed were enemy positions, which turned out to be another American platoon. The geography of the island and the converging advance routes meant that these separate Allied forces were, in effect, unknowingly stalking each other. The chaos was compounded from the sea when, in a tragic case of misidentification, an American destroyer shelled Allied positions on the beach, adding naval artillery to the symphony of self-inflicted destruction. When the fog finally lifted and the shooting stopped, the grim tally was taken. In the absence of any Japanese soldiers, the Allied force had suffered between 28 and 32 men killed in action, and more than 50 wounded, all by their own comrades' hands. Furthermore, the brutal Arctic conditions and the hazardous landscape claimed an additional 130 casualties from trench foot, accidental detonations of Japanese booby traps, and vehicle accidents. The liberation of Kiska was complete, but it had been achieved at a bitter and deeply ironic cost. The battle for Kiska did not end on the first day. For nearly 3 days, Allied troops conducted a painstaking and nerve-wracking advance across the island, their progress slowed by the treacherous terrain, the ever-present fog, and the constant, gnawing fear that the Japanese were lying in wait in a final, fortified redoubt. It was a slow and deliberate process of uncovering the truth. They found meticulously cleaned barracks, warehouses of abandoned supplies, and a handful of stray dogs, one of which would be adopted as the mascot, Kiska the Canadian war dog. But they found no people. The stunning realization gradually dawned on the command structure. They had been utterly and completely duped. The Japanese had not just withdrawn, they had executed one of the most audacious and successful evacuations of the entire war, spiriting away over 5,000 men right under the noses of a massive blockade. The relief that a costly invasion had been avoided was immediately tempered by a profound and deepening embarrassment. How had such a massive enemy movement gone entirely undetected? Newspapers, while announcing the liberation of Kiska, struggled to frame the story, often burying the incredible truth of the empty island and the friendly fire casualties under triumphant headlines about the strategic victory and the reclamation of American soil. The official military reports, eager to put the best face on a deeply awkward situation, heavily downplayed the tragic friendly fire incidents, choosing instead to focus on the successful outcome of the campaign. The Aleutians were now fully back in Allied hands. Analyzing the failure of Operation Cottage reveals a perfect storm of human and natural factors. At its core was the profound psychological shadow of the Battle of At-2. The trauma of that brutal high-casualty fight created an unshakable expectation of fierce resistance, causing planners to interpret every piece of ambiguous intelligence through the lens of their own fears. This predisposition was masterfully exploited by the Japanese in a display of brilliant deception. Their radio silence, followed by carefully timed decoy signals, combined with the flawless timing and execution of Operation KE, showcased a level of operational cunning that Allied intelligence was simply not prepared for. Compounding this was the literal and figurative fog of war. The Aleutian weather acted as a force multiplier for the Japanese, providing the essential cover for their escape and then later blinding and disorienting the invading Allied troops, turning them against each other. Ultimately, these elements point to a critical intelligence failure. Despite having a formidable naval and aerial presence, the Allies failed to positively confirm the enemy's presence for nearly 3 weeks, relying on assumptions and circumstantial evidence instead of definitive proof. In the final analysis, Operation Cottage stands not as a tale of military glory, but as a stark and enduring lesson in the annals of military history. It was a battle fought not against a tangible enemy, but against the intangible forces of fear, flawed assumption, and the chaos of war. The 35,000 Allied soldiers who stormed the shores of Kiska, with all their training, courage, and preparation, found no enemy to engage. They found only the ghosts of their own expectations, the lingering evidence of a vanished garrison. In the end, the only battle that occurred was the one they tragically waged upon themselves in the soupy, disorienting fog. The Aleutian campaign was over, but its conclusion was one of profound irony and pointless sacrifice, a somber reminder that in war, the greatest dangers can sometimes come not from the enemy, but from the demons of uncertainty within.